my two friends and colleagues for whom I know for many years. Honestly, when I was first invited, David, I think, approached me first to participate, I raised an eyebrow. Why are they inviting me? By the end of the day, I'm not an expert in legal history. That's my initial thoughts but then it came to my mind that I wrote about the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary in Israel, the relationship between the Arab citizens of the State of Israel and Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, addressing also certain historical issues. But by the end of the day, legal scholars, we are multidisciplinary researchers, and that's why I ended up agreeing, and I'm happy that I did so. First, I had the chance to read the book twice. Now, you would ask why. First time I read it to understand the arguments and understand the theme of the book. But second time, I needed to dive deep in the book to understand and fully comprehend certain details or even kind of methodology of the book. And let me start, I was asked to commentate on the book, so commentating on the book means that I should provide certain compliments and as well as certain comments, let's call them. I think this book is fascinating for many reasons. Usually there's a trend, basically after World War II, that we emphasize the rule of law with you, right? And then we discuss issues concerning human rights through the role that the law plays in our daily life, in our diplomatic life, in our political life, in our social life. I think this is one of the only books I have the chance to read where you have two themes. First, it highlights the role that the law played in a time where most of us might have thought that the law did not have any place, particularly not in daily life between Arabs and Jews under mandatory Palestine, but in the context of international law regarding the internal relationship between Arabs and Jews under a foreign local regime, which is the British, and I'm still not sure whether it's foreign regime or local regime. It depends whom you ask. And at the same time, basically, I think when you refer to Ali Pasha at the end of the book, we come to the wisdom that although the law is a very important instrument through which we can resolve many of our problems, it is not necessarily the proper instrument to adhere to, always. And I say this with a great smile because recently I have written a book, an article, I'm sorry, I wish I wrote a book, but it was an article about the issue concerning the legal status of Arabic in Israel, especially after the enactment of basic law, Israel, the nation state of Israel's Jewish state. And sometimes you think of, there's the CDR theories concerning conflicts with the religious dimension. So, and these theories provide you with other tools apart, from the classic formal legal tools, which we are very familiar with, where you can have more suitable resolutions than the firm, formal legal ones. And I think this is basically the outcome of the book, if I guess correctly. That is, they have tried. And those who are trying nowadays, particularly the PLO or the Palestinian Authority, you highlight this point in the introduction of the book, you better not approach, even if you don't say this clearly, you better not approach this way, because if you look at history, both sides should understand that it doesn't work. So the book, to that extent, the book is really innovative. It provides genuine arguments. Besides the fact that all scholarship concerning legal issues of that period of time, 1922 till 1948, and there's a lot of scholarship on that period, legal scholarship. It basically focuses on let's call them the ordinary daily legal problems between the citizens of mandatory Palestine, being Arabs, Arab Muslims, Arab Christians, the Jews, and the interrelationship between all sides. But to highlight that questions of international law within tools of public law, constitutional law / administrative law, invoking international law arguments within the framework of a domestic, so far quote-unquote domestic regime, this is something very new. I didn't have a chance to read any, and I did the research before I came here to make sure that my argument is correct. So I didn't find. So it's either I'm a bad researcher or I'm a really good researcher. Either way, I hope I'm a good researcher. Another interesting point of the book, we usually speak of the Israeli-Arab conflict from 1948 all the way up. And I think interestingly and remarkably, you try to stretch the conflict back to 1922. Now, of course, we are all aware of the arguments that existed already under the British mandate. I mean, the story did not start in 1948. But to start speaking of the Arab-Israeli conflict, like the Arab and the Israeli conflict in 1922, where you did not have any political identity, any political entity such as Israel as a state and Palestine as a state, I mean, this is something new, and I mean, it works both ways. It could be like, why are you talking about this? This is way strange. But at the same time, it gives us certain thoughts about our contemporary handling of the conflict, and maybe the future, hopefully, to the best. As I thought originally, I had the impression that I'm talking about, or I'm reading a scholarship in legal history. It is indeed, but it's way more than that. I mean, this is a very comprehensive and a deep research that deals with legal history, but at the same time you demonstrate a very high level. I'm sorry that I'm giving you grades on that. I mean, it should be obvious, but on different legal aspects, like you should know that the laws of land in Israel, the contracts law, international law. Sometimes making the comparison between international law as we know it after World War II and discussing it, comparing it with some customary international law prior to World War II, which is very, I would say, it triggers my thought, without taking any side. Now, at the same time, I had some problems with the book, I have to admit, and definitely, I don't have the time to discuss these thoughts in depth, but I would like to point out these issues. Hopefully, they might raise discussion afterwards. In particular, the book is about two questions: the legality of the Balfour Declaration and the claims regarding the winning war. I mean, you state straightforward that these are the most important questions of the time. Now, this could be true. I don't know. I mean, I didn't live at the time. I basically deal my research with contemporary law, not with history. But at least I was left without clear answer why you think these are the most important questions. What were the other questions? What kind of interplay could have been between these two questions and other questions, even in daily life of the Jews and the Arabs of mandatory Palestine? Now, of course, it sounds very tempting to discuss these questions in particular. First, because the Balfour Declaration was invoked by the Palestinians recently, arguing against it, etc., etc. And second, because the Wailing Wall is like well, I would say annually we live with it, but recently, in a daily basis, we discuss questions concerning the Wailing Wall in relationship to the conflict between Arabs and Jews. My second problem is with the title of the book. I mean, if you read the title of your book, you get the impression that the book is going to discuss the Arab-Israeli, I mean, we should say maybe the Israeli, well, the Arab-Israeli, I'm not sure. In any case, the conflict between the Arab states and Israel. Ultimately, the two questions basically are concerned with what we call nowadays the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not with the conflict between Israel and other Arab countries. I'm not saying that there were no prominent Arab, leaders who were involved in these issues. Of course, they were. You refer to them and you discuss them, and there are Arab countries that were involved as well. But it should be clarified that what we're talking about is ultimately the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as we see it nowadays from a historical background. And I will get back to this point because there's something quite interesting about referring to the word Palestinians. A third point was the issue of referring to the Arab citizens of mandatory Palestine. In many cases, it was very important for you to say the Muslims of mandatory Palestine. Now, I am aware that this was particularly done in reference to the Wailing Wall issues and Al-Aqsa and the Wailing Wall, etc. But this is very important because I'm Muslim by myself, and sometimes there is a wrong impression that all problems occur from the Arab side by Muslims, as if the Christians were the Ashkenazis of this land. And I always say, well, wait, I mean we're not competing between each other who's more problematic, but to be faithful for the historical record, I mean the most prominent nationalistic figures, even before 1948, were Christians. And for many reasons, they were and they remain the most highly educated, the most famous lawyers, even prior to the establishment of the state of Israel, were Christians. I guess they represented Muslims in their cases before the different institutes. And speaking of their economic status, they were wealthy, because they were educated as compared to the Muslims who basically dealt with farming. So this is a very important, because the issue was more nationalistic rather than a religious issue. And people tend to create mishmash between the two concepts. And you know what? I even dare to invoke here and to play the concept of equality before the law. I mean, so far we're speaking about the rule of law and the role of the law played at that time. I'm not making any position here because I'm not sure about my position, but we don't really know whether equality before the law was guaranteed through all these procedures that you describe in the book. Definitely not towards the British, although in many instances you discuss them as if they were equal players in a horizontal level. They're not. I mean, at worst they are the arbitrators, but at best for them, of course, I mean, they are the rulers of the land, and they decide whom to promise and what to promise, and who gave them the authority to promise in the first place. The last point in this regard is basically concerning the word Palestinian. There were enough instances where I found you referring or drawing a direct line between the Palestinians of nowadays and the Arab Palestinians of that time, as if the arguments were the same. Take, for instance, the Balfour Declaration. You mentioned this in the introduction, that they're trying to invoke the rights against Israel by challenging the legality of the Balfour Declaration. Nowadays, this is what they did before, there is a line, of course. I cannot negate that, but I doubt if it's a direct line. And I say so because we should remember that the National Palestinian movement, of course, it was established in the early years of the 1920s, but initially, significantly, the growth was basically after the 60s war, after the biggest failure of the Arab countries, and by that time they had the power, or some countries would say the nerve, to say, we will take our fate in our hands, we don't need your help, we've seen enough. And therefore, I would be very hesitant in drawing this direct line, exactly as I would do the same hesitation in drawing the direct line between the arguments provided by the Jewish representatives in 1922 and those who represent the state of Israel. But here I come to conclude, and I'd like to say the following. I definitely enjoyed reading the book. I read it twice. I already informed my students about the book and my colleagues about the book. I promised to read it the third time because I think I have things to write about this book. So it's, I mean, this is a first project that could be in a chain of projects, and I'm quite sure you're writing already your second book. I didn't know that. Anyway, thank you very much for having the chance.